The hall was silent, but not with peace. It was the heavy silence of an approaching storm. The young maid had been dragged through the stone corridors to the center of the chamber. The torches cast shadows that danced on the walls, creating the sensation that the castle itself was watching her, awaiting the cruel spectacle about to unfold. The rumor had spread like fire in dry straw. Someone had tampered with the wine served to the Lord's advisor. The suspicion fell upon the last person to touch the chalicer. The metallic chill of the iron rings hanging from the wall already betrayed her fate. The whispers of the guards, the restrained breath of the maids around her, the crack of boots against the stone floor, everything mixed into an almost unbearable atmosphere of suspense. The young woman's heart beat like a war drum, but there was no place to run. When Lady Whitmore entered, draped in black velvet with a piercing gaze and the upright posture of someone above any judgment, the entire room seemed to bow. "Bring her here," she ordered. And then, before everyone, she announced in a firm voice, "If she will not speak with her mouth, she will speak through laughter." A collective shiver ran through the onlookers. There would be no whips, no burning irons. The punishment would be another subtler and more devastating. What seemed innocent laughter would be transformed into a weapon until the truth was mercilessly extracted. England's 17th century. The great manor houses were small kingdoms within the kingdom where the law of the lord or lady was more immediate than the decrees of the monarch. Their hierarchy was not only social, it was sacred. Nobles embodied order and servants absolute obedience. Discipline was maintained not only by the threat of lash or steel but by a psychological system of humiliations. Laughter, a symbol of joy and lightness, could be twisted into a tool of punishment. The so-called tickle torture was not officially recorded in legal documents, but its use passed through certain aristocratic households as a perverse secret. The belief was simple. The body may resist pain, but it can hardly resist its own involuntary reaction to laughter. In this type of punishment, no external marks remained, which is why it was preferred by families who wished to punish without staining their servants' appearance. The cruelty in this case was silent, invisible, but profound. For Lady Whitmore, the honor of the house stood above any individual innocence. If the wine had been tampered with, someone had to answer whether there was solid proof or not. The interrogation was more a spectacle of power than a search for truth. At that time, public shame carried more weight than any wound, and thus what seemed to be just another banquet night turned into the stage of a dark ritual where laughter would be wrenched out by force until it became confession. Her name was Isabella, and she was 19. The daughter of peasants, she had arrived at the Whitmore household just over 6 months earlier. Her clear eyes still carried the innocence of youth, but also the constant fear of making mistakes. Tall, thin, with hands marked by scrubbing, washing, and serving, she embodied the typical figure of a silent, obedient maid. That night, she wore the simple raw cotton attire covered by a worn apron stained from the day's work. Her dark hair was tied under a white kerchief, as the household's etiquette demanded. But there was something in her demeanor that distinguished her, a certain delicacy in the way she moved, as if she had been molded never to draw attention. Isabella was neither rebellious nor bold. On the contrary, she was shy, almost invisible. She lived between the kitchen and the hall, always in silence, learning to observe more than speak. She only dreamed of saving enough coins to help her younger siblings who had stayed behind in the village. But that night, fate dragged her brutally into the center of attention. Before the banquet, her routine had been ordinary, gathering the clean clothes, checking the shine of the cutlery, filling the jugs of wine. But it was enough that Sir Edmund, the Lord's advisor, suffered a sudden illness for all eyes to turn to her. The logic was cruel. If Isabella had served the wine, then the guilt was hers. From invisible maid, she became defendant. From quiet shadow, she became target. The great hall had fallen into silence after Sir Edmund's malaise. The guests, frightened, whispered their hypothesis. Poison was always the ghost at the tables of the powerful, and the mere suspicion was enough to spark panic. Isabella had barely had time to react. The steward pointed her out before everyone. It was she who served the chalice. Lady Whitmore rose, her black dress gliding across the floor like a living shadow. "Bring her," she ordered. The guards did not hesitate. dragged to the hall, Isabella tried to mutter her innocence, but her voice was lost before the accusatory gazes. The guests watched with a mix of fear and morbid excitement. Suspicion turned into spectacle. At the center, Lady Whitmore was not seeking rational answers. Her mind had already judged. Isabella, the insignificant maid, must be tested. If she was innocent, she would resist. If she was guilty, she would confess. Before all the sentence fell, she will speak, whether she wishes it or not. The chamber chosen for the interrogation was not a dark dungeon, but the manor's secondary hall, a space decorated for private meetings. That choice was no accident. Lady Whitmore wanted the discipline to be clear. Punishment could happen anywhere at any time without the need for hiding. It was a message for all. The room was warmed by the fireplace, but the heat brought no comfort. On the contrary, it made the sweat trickle down Isabella's neck even before any touch. The tapestries on the walls depicted hunting scenes as if the embroidered eyes of the hounds and hunters watched the scene. At the center, a red velvet chaise longue had been dragged to serve as a stage. 2 male servants seized Isabella by the arms and forced her to sit. Silk scarves were brought. They were not ordinary torture tools. They were soft, almost beautiful, but it was with them that her wrists and ankles were bound, fastening her to the chaise. There was no brutal violence, no blows. It was a calculated imprisonment where the delicacy of the gesture contrasted with the cruelty of the intent. Her breathing was fast, her eyes teary, her heartbeat like a war drum echoing in her chest. The silence was broken only by the crackling of flames and the soft snap of silk tightening against her skin. Lady Whitmore approached slowly. With a theatrical gesture, she bent to remove the maid's shoes. The feet were exposed to the cold, vulnerable. Isabella shivered, not only from the chill, but from the dreadful awareness of what was about to happen. Lady Whitmore smiled, a small, almost indulgent smile, and declared to all present, "Steel leaves marks. Iron mutilates, but there are ways to punish that do not require blood. This one will serve." The room sank into expectant silence. The first touch was almost gentle. Lady Whitmore ran the tip of a finger along Isabella's sole, as though testing the surface of rare silk. The young woman's body reacted immediately. A jolt, a gasp, her toes curling as if seeking escape from the stimulus. The reaction was enough to draw the first murmur from the silent audience. The servants watching turned their eyes away, but could not hide their discomfort. Isabella bit her lips, determined to resist, but Lady Whitmore was in no hurry. Her fingers explored every line, every ridge of skin, until an involuntary laugh escaped the maid's throat. The sound echoed loudly, almost out of place in the solemn atmosphere. The laugh was not of joy, but of humiliation, and Lady Whitmore tilted her head. "Satisfied. Interesting," she murmured. "The body speaks. Even when the mouth refuses, the intensity grew. Now it was not just a finger, but a whole hand, nails tracing paths across the sensitive skin." Isabella arched, pulling her wrists against the silk bonds. But there was no escape. The laughter grew louder, uncontrolled, broken by desperate gasps. Lady Whitmore, impassive, observed every reaction like a scholar before an experiment. At stake was not only a confession, but a display of power. The maid's laughter was her victory. The proof she could control even the most intimate reactions of those under her authority. Isabella was already breathing with difficulty, her chest rising and falling frantically. The audience was still absorbed by the disturbing contrast between the gentleness of the gesture and the cruelty of its effect. The punishment had begun, and with every second it became clear resistance would be impossible. The touch was not confined to her feet. Soon Lady Whitmore moved up her legs, exploring ribs, hips, and abdomen. Her fingers moved like invisible torture instruments, finding every sensitive spot, every breach in Isabella's body. With each new assault, a wave of uncontrollable laughter burst forth, punctuated by sobs and tears. The laughter echoed against the stone walls, filling the hall with a paradoxical sound. It seemed like joy, but it was pure despair. Isabella's body trembled, arching against the bonds, struggling to escape in any way. The laughter was joined by tears streaming down her face, making it clear there was no pleasure, only the brutal exposure of her weakness. "Speak," commanded Lady Whitmore between sessions. "Confess who sent you," but there was nothing to say. Isabella repeated between gasps and laughter that she was innocent. The denial did not stop the torture. On the contrary, it intensified it. The older maids watched in silence, absorbing the lesson. The spectacle was not just to tear out a confession, but to demonstrate the extent of Lady Whitmore's power. The message was clear. Even laughter could be controlled. Even joy itself could be turned against someone. Isabella's face was flushed. Her muscles exhausted. Her laughter now came hoarse, almost like sobs of pain. Time seemed suspended. Each second stretched into an eternity of humiliation. The audience, though silent, could not escape their discomfort. The punishment revealed not only the maid's fragility, but the cruelty of the one who inflicted it. At the center of the hall, Isabella was no longer merely a servant. She was an example, a body turned into a living lesson of discipline and obedience. After long minutes, Isabella's body seemed about to collapse. Her breathing was shallow, irregular, and her eyes brimmed, nearly closing. The laughter, once loud and frantic, now came broken, almost suffocated, as though the very air was running out. It was in this state that Lady Whitmore bent over her and spoke softly, so that only the nearest could hear, "Confess, and it ends. Deny, and we continue until laughter destroys you." The young woman shook her head, unable to speak. The fingers returned to her armpits, slid down her ribs, and reached her feet again. Her body convulsed, desperate laughter echoing through the hall. And then, at the limit between resistance and collapse, Isabella's voice broke. It was me." The cry came between laughter and sobs, a confession forced out. It did not matter whether it was truth or lie. What mattered was the sound of the words. Lady Whitmore straightened, triumphant. Silence fell over the room. The laughter ceased, replaced by the maid's stifled sobs. The weight of confession hung in the air like a final sentence. Lady Whitmore, with icy calm, turned to the onlookers and declared, "This is how truth is obtained." There was no jury, no defense, only the absolute power of a lady over her maid. Isabella was released from the bonds, but she could not stand. She fell to her knees on the floor, arms trembling, throat raw from forced laughter. The marks were not on her body, but in her spirit. There were no visible wounds, only the bitter memory of her own laughter turned into humiliation. The audience began to disperse silently. No one dared comment. The spectacle had served its purpose. All had learned the lesson. In the Whitmore household, obedience was the only currency that mattered. Lady Whitmore did not smile, did not celebrate. She only observed Isabella coldly as one evaluates an object that has fulfilled its purpose. "Take her back to the servants' quarters," she ordered. "She will resume her work tomorrow." There was no forgiveness, no acknowledgement of innocence, only the relentless cycle of hierarchy. Isabella, dragged back through the corridors, knew nothing would change. The next day she would serve at the table as always. But within her, something had broken. Laughter, once light, had become a weapon. In that manner, no physical scars remained. But the memory of the night echoed like a ghost in every corridor. For Isabella, the sound of her own laughter would never be the same again. What once meant joy now recalled submission, impotence, pain. Lady Whitmore's cruelty did not lie in explicit violence, but in the manipulation of what seemed most innocent, and that is precisely what makes stories like this so disturbing. They show how even the simplest gestures can be twisted into instruments of power. The castle remained in silence. Isabella continued serving. Silent, invisible. But inside her, laughter echoed still, like an invisible chain that would never be broken. And thus arises the question left for us. How many times throughout history has joy been turned into a weapon? How many servants, how many victims, many innocents had laughter torn from them by force until it became confession? After all, when even laughter can be used as torture, what remains of human freedom? And if you think this was the strangest form of medieval punishment, wait until you hear the next story, because pain did not always come from chains and steel, sometimes it came from the unexpected.